Hey, welcome back to the Unbelievable Podcast. I am BJ Reidell, back here with my guy, Drew Mahowald, and today we are talking about another Minnesota Vikings victory. Yes, your Minnesota Vikings overcame the Detroit Lions 34-20 yesterday as of this recording, and have now won 2 games in a row, which by some standards is a winning streak, which is something that the Vikings, of course, have not had this season and wasn't something that, 2 weeks ago we weren't foreseeing. And all of a sudden, that kind of irrational hope that Drew and I were alluding to on last week's show has blossomed into something a little bit more objectively rational
Yeah,
and
I'd
potentially,
say so.
and potentially a little bit more than that. So Drew and I will go through this most recent Vikings 30 plus offensive output performance. And another 200-yard performance from Dalvin, or I should say his first 200 rushing yard performance from Dalvin Cook, and all the good things the other Vikings did on Sunday. So we'll do that and then kind of see where we're headed here. We got a big matchup next week against Chicago, of course, which we talked about before. And Act 2 has now been completed in terms of getting this team back to relevancy before Thanksgiving. So, all right, let's dig into this here. So your Vikings, of course, winning by a pretty solid margin once again. If you were watching that game, it kind of lost. You lost any hope for Detroit probably around the second quarter, based off the way that Dalvin Cook was playing and the way that the offense was humming. Again, this really seems like more of a Dalvin Cook game, but because of what we always do, let's start with the quarterback position here with Kirk Cousins. His numbers were pretty. He wasn't asked to do a whole lot. The numbers are good: 13 for 20, 220, 11 yards per attempt average. And then 3 touchdown passes, only sacked once yesterday. What do you think of Kirk Cousins?
The Vikings are going against the grain here, right? Because every team in the league, it seems like, is asking their quarterback to do more and more each week, each year in the NFL. The Vikings and Mike Zimmer's philosophy and Gary Kubiak now are going against the grain and essentially trying to get Kirk to do as little as possible to win games. And the last 2 weeks, it has worked out beautifully. I think this week he had 20 pass attempts. Last week was 14. Meanwhile, Dalvin's had 30 carries and then 22 this week, and Madison had 12 against the Lions as well. So, it truly is building off of the run, but creating play action off of an effective run game. And for the longest time, I think if you go read what the analytics say and what kind of the modern approach is to the NFL, it doesn't matter who your running back is for play action, it's going to work. Or passing the ball 7 out of 10 plays is more efficient than running the ball half the time. And the Vikings are actually running the ball more than half the time, and yet their offense has been dominant 2 weeks in a row. Now, that could be the product of playing a poor defense twice in a row, at least against the run, right? Green Bay and Detroit, not great against the run defensively. But either way, it's working. Gary Kubiak has this team humming in terms of efficiency, and for as much as you like to criticize him for, calling runs on second and long, for example, the zone running situation here is working out really well. Offensive line is playing well, and it doesn't seem like anybody can stop this run game right now, which is nice to have that type of momentum moving forward against Chicago here.
So I'm glad that you brought up the efficiency of this offense relative to Kirk Cousins' statistics, because I prepared those statistics for you.
Love that.
Kirk Cousins over the last 2 weeks for the Vikings: 24 for 34, 480 yards, and 4 touchdown passes. Those are the volume numbers. That sounds like a really, really, really high-scoring game for what? In college, probably? That sounds like a Patrick Mahomes, Texas Tech
game. It sounds like a Big 12 game.
Yeah, Big 12 game. Thank you. But to split that up over the last 2 weeks: 11 for 14 for 160 and 1 against Green Bay, which, of course, is a victory. Then yesterday's performance, which we went over before: 13 for 20, 220, and 3. So those are the output numbers, your volume numbers. Now, I went ahead and put together what the drives have looked like for the Vikings over the last 2 weeks as well, since I think that this is more telling in terms of the efficiency of this offense. So as you recall, last week against Green Bay, some of the highest efficiency you'll ever see in terms of offensive output: 7 drives for the Vikings, the first 4 all touchdowns. The next 3, when they're kind of just, trying to maintain control, 3 straight punts. So they go 4 for 7 in terms of touchdown drives. Mm-hmm. Yesterday against Detroit, the first 2 drives, again, touchdowns, followed by a punt, but then they went right back to a touchdown, another punt, back to another touchdown, and then we kind of hit that territory where we're going to talk about it, but the blocked punt situation, and then you mix in a late touchdown as well to kind of put it out of reach. But ultimately, 11 drives against Detroit yesterday, 5 for 11. That in total, then, if you do that mental math, 9 for 18 in terms of touchdown drives over the past 2 weeks. I'm not talking points. I'm talking touchdowns. 50% of the drives over the last 2 weeks. And I think most of us can make the argument that about half of those remaining drives didn't really matter all that much anyways. So it wasn't, the Vikings were punting, and yes, the 2 blocked punts were concerning to say the least, but they weren't a high issue situation, right? This isn't the Vikings trying to drive down and tie the game and they have a blocked punt. No, this is the Vikings trying to maintain a 2-score lead and they have a blocked punt. So in terms of overall efficiency, 50% touchdown drives the last 2 weeks. That continued, of course, against Detroit. And then, of course, this is all being put together with the run game. Dalvin Cook has been, unstoppable, straight up. Like there's no better way to win a football game than running the ball straight down someone's throat, if you can do it. If you can run the ball efficiently at the clip that Dalvin Cook has been doing at 9.4 yesterday against Detroit, and 5.5 against the Packers with a higher workload. So you're looking at about 7 to 8 yards per carry over the past 2 weeks. If you can run it like that, do it 100% of the time. Mm-hmm. It's just that much more efficient. You can control the clock that much better. You don't have to worry about an interception, although you do have to somewhat worry about a fumble, I suppose. But it's the most efficient way to win a football game if you can do it, and the Vikings are showing they can do it.
So here are the numbers, right? I also have these ready for the efficiency of the Vikings offense in the entire season. Now, these have clearly been boosted the last couple of weeks by great performances, but the Vikings are currently first in the NFL in yards per play at 6.5, first in passing yards per attempt at 8.9, and first in net yards per attempt at 7.9. So that also takes into account like interceptions, right? Kirk has a lot of interceptions, but despite that, he's still leading in net yards per attempt. And then they're also first in rushing yards per carry at 5.5. So essentially, the Vikings have been the most efficient team passing the ball and the most efficient team running the ball. And so it's tough to kind of let those numbers sink in because it's hard to understand that the Vikings have been that good offensively, given that some of these games it seems like have been just clunkers. But if you look at it and you realize that like the Falcons game and the Colts game, like what really did them in was just really, really bad turnovers by Kirk Cousins that put the team in a bad spot. If you take those turnovers out, this offense is moving the ball relatively well, actually extremely well compared to the rest of the league. So, they're doing it old school. They're doing it with running the ball first, establishing their run, so to speak, and then going play action, which has kind of an old school philosophy, but it's working. The Vikings are doing it, and Dalvin Cook is making a large argument here to say that, he's worth that big contract that was kind of controversial.
Absolutely. And all of that, by the way, makes it that much more frustrating that the Vikings lost a couple 1-point games, right? Mm-hmm. Or 1-score games, I should say. This team now, now that we have the information in front of us, we know what has officially happened over the past 2 weeks. Now this team looks like a 5-3 team and not a 3-5 team. And it's just all, a wrong bounce of the football. And we go from being in a position where 2 weeks ago, I'm screaming that the season's over. And now I'm screaming, I don't know, beat the Bears and we'll talk. Again, we'll get into that later on in the show here, but the Vikings have swiftly changed what, the prospect of this season. If they lose to the Chicago next Monday, things might be different. But the performance of this team, it just doesn't make sense with their record because their defense is not as bad.
It has not been. It's been really improved the last 2 games, I'd say.
I would agree. So the defense is not as bad as a 3-5 team would suggest, assuming that 3-5 team is the number 1 offensive team in the NFL in terms of efficiency. Like it just doesn't really compute. Like the numbers don't like.
It makes sense. It makes sense when you factor in, well, you have a loss against Seattle, which was, at the time, and I would say still, Russell Wilson is one of the premier MVP candidates in the league. And that game easily could have been, flip Minnesota's way. Same with the Tennessee game, another really good team at only 2 losses this year. And so I think when you look back to the Vikings, at least in terms of the NFC, I saw it today too, the toughest schedule to date so far in terms of opponent winning percentage. I don't know how that compares in the AFC, if there's anybody tougher there, but the Vikings have the toughest NFC schedule so far in terms of opponent win percentage. And then it's going to get drastically easier, as we've already discussed several times already on the show. Like the schedule is going to get way easier down the stretch here. And that is another reason for optimism here for Minnesota. And, to a degree, they have been playing better than their record. It's just really, to me, it's just 2 really, really bad performances that are kind of watering things down. It's Atlanta and Indianapolis. If they had even competed in those games, kept it close, you would kind of have some more optimism even about maybe a playoff push, like, oh, this team actually is better. But those 2 performances are just kind of hanging in the back of my mind as, you saw. I mean, Atlanta, not a great team. Indianapolis, they're, still kind of on that border of are they real, are they not? But those 2 teams wiped out the Vikings, and it's really hard to understand what happened in those 2 performances. But other than those 2 games, this Vikings offense has been fluid, been really efficient, and really elite compared to the rest of the league.
Absolutely. So let's talk more about this offense and how they played against Detroit specifically, right? You talked about, it really is as simple as a zone running scheme and Kirk Cousins running play action, right? Like,
seriously, that's it. That's that's the only formula, and it's working to perfection.
So Dalvin Cook is doing a couple of things, right, that makes him that much better than everyone else, right? So you look at, honestly, the spread between Dalvin Cook and Alexander Mattison yesterday against Detroit is a good kind of sample for looking at the difference between arguably the best running back in the NFL and a running back you can get in the mid rounds and plug in and get performance out of, right? Alexander Mattison proved yesterday that your theory, and your long running theory at that, is accurate. You can draft a guy in the 3rd round out of God knows where, in this case, Boise State, and you could plug him into a high functioning offense and they'll put out good numbers. 12 for 69 for 5.8. That's what you get from Alexander Mattison. That's a great day at the yard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dalvin Cook, on the other hand, the guy that we all decided to pay, the guy that you and I are still kind of on the fence on paying because of just sheer principle, I suppose, is proving that by paying him, you get kind of a next level. And now the problem with that is that you don't pay, like, yes, you pay game by game, but you pay for the overall performance. You're not going to get 206 from Dalvin Cook every week. At this rate, you might, but generally speaking, you're not going to get that. But this is what you're paying for. This is the difference. 22 carries, so almost double, and you get 9.4 yards per attempt, which is ridiculous and a complete outlier, don't get me wrong. But this is the difference between your average plug-and-play running back and Dalvin Cook. And you can literally, like, it shows in the volume, because when Dalvin Cook gets to that second level, and I said this last week, so I'm going to regurgitate it a little bit, but kind of expand off of, what we saw yesterday. Because we did see, I know there's 10 guys on the field, but the long run by Dalvin Cook is a perfect example of what makes him elite versus, think of like Joe Mixon. Solid running back, not elite, in my opinion. Because when he gets to the second level, Joe Mixon falls forward. That's a good thing. You're going to get 6 yards. When Dalvin Cook gets to the second level, he's got one defender in front of him, maybe a deep safety over the top that he sees as well. He gets past that first guy every time. And he does it by so many different ways, right? Whether it's his vision, just straight up like eluding the guy with his eyes and going to the different path to get out of that guy's way. That's one. Two, just straight up elusiveness, whether it's a juke or lowering his shoulder, ducking his head, doing any number of things that you can do with the little stick on Madden. That's Dalvin Cook in real life when he hits that second level. And three, he can spin. He can jump over you, and he's just straight up better at you at football 9 times out of 10 than the guy that he's going up against, right? That linebacker at the second level, 9 times out of 10, he's not as good of a football player as Dalvin Cook. Just straight up. He's just not. So Dalvin Cook is going to get around him most of the time, whereas a guy like Alexander Mattison, you'll take those 8 yards all day long, but Dalvin Cook is going to turn that into 70. You forget a guy in the field, Dalvin Cook knows that guy's not there, he's gone.
Yeah, that's one thing you should probably know. That's very Detroit, by the way, is that they had 10 people on the field for that 70-yard touchdown.
A fireable offense.
Awesome. It's one of those, like, it's a bold strategy, Cotton. Put 10 guys in the field against Dalvin Cook. But speaking on the value of Dalvin Cook, right? So part of the reason that, we were all skeptical is because the value of the running back position has been in doubt the past couple of years. And, you see like McCaffrey and Ezekiel Elliott and these guys get massive deals, and you wonder how much, is their production replaceable? But so I'm looking at EPA per rush, right? So estimated points added per rush. It's one of those advanced stats, right, to measure efficiency. So before this year, the highest number back to 1999, which is sort of the era that it was tracked, EPA per rush. The highest number is 0.167. That was Jamal Charles in 2010. 0.167. Okay. Dalvin Cook so far this year is 0.196. So he is absolutely crushing that highest number out of the ballpark. So he's essentially been the most efficient runner at running back, most efficient running back season so far through 8 games in the last 2 decades, and that's including the Adrian Peterson 2012 season. So, I mean, I'm not saying he's been better than Adrian Peterson at that point or that season, but what he's doing is truly it's elite and it's historic so far. And now we'll get to see if this lasts against the Chicago defense. That's going to be much better than the Vikings have seen recently.
Dalvin Cook through 7 games, by the way. He did miss the 1 game too.
Yeah, true.
Still leading the NFL in rushing, touchdowns. Also, of course, naturally leading in yards per game as well at 122, which is ridiculous. By the way, I'm going to do some quick math here. I can't do that in my head, but 122.6 on a 16-game pace, that calculates to 1,961 yards, folks. That's not bad. That's not bad at all.
No.
All right, so
that is very close to the all-time single season record. I mean, that's like 40 yards off of it, if I'm doing my math right. That was so 40, something like that. But like either way, I don't know if it's sustainable because there's knock on wood, but like there's injuries and stuff. Dalvin's not been the healthiest in his career, but just at some point a team's going to stop the run, right? Like, and I would imagine the Bears are going to have a better game plan, a better plan for that than Detroit or Green Bay. And that's where this game plan in itself of just pounding Dalvin Cook over and over won't be as sustainable. And then you're going to have to rely on Kirk Cousins just a little bit more.
Absolutely. I mean, at some point they're going to have to throw the ball again. You just kind of hope that for the Vikings' sake that this train doesn't stop for a little bit longer, right?
Oh yeah.
Because I keep leading into what we're going to be talking about in the back half of the show, but like we got an opportunity here with a big obstacle in front of the Vikings. And it's either going to be the biggest buzzkill in recent Viking history, or it's going to be another step towards the promised land of getting to the playoffs as that 7th seed, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so outside of Dalvin Cook, which I could spend the rest of this podcast talking about, you guys all know that he's been outstanding. We can spout efficiency numbers till we're blue in the face, and they'll still come out in being number 1. He's the best running back in the NFL currently. There's really no objective debate about that. If he keeps doing things like this, like we said, the numbers that it comes out to over a 16-game span are ridiculous. So, all right. So we went over Cook, we went over Madison, we went over Cousins. Now there are other football players on this team, shockingly. Justin Jefferson had a nice game as well. Only 3 catches. He did leave the team in yards with 64, but he continues to kind of show you that big playability. Down the sideline, getting himself open one-on-one against press and zone. He's doing a nice job in all facets of the game, and he's extremely reliable, right? When the ball goes up into Justin Jefferson's territory, I think most Vikings fans are feeling very confident with that right now, just based out the way that he's been able to catch the ball in traffic, catch the ball coming across the field, even catching it when it's wide open. Those situations that we've seen too many times where Vikings receivers have dropped it in a meaningful time. Jefferson seems as sure-handed as ever. He kind of fits that build that Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs put in front of him beforehand. And he's doing everything that you can ask for and more, really. Another ridiculous game for him. And then, of course, you've also got Irv Smith, who it's funny to call a 2-10-2 a breakout performance, but we kind of saw everything.
He was due for a couple scores just based on, the last couple of games he's been getting more involved, and it was good to see him kind of show up as an option in the red zone there for Kirk a couple times there. I think there was one where, Kyle Rudolph was probably way more open than Smith, but it was either way, a touchdown is a touchdown. Irv Smith is doing his job, and he's been a much better blocker, I think, than we maybe expected. So he probably deserved a couple scores there.
Absolutely. He gets based off of the game that he blocked against Green Bay, he deserved 2 scores alone. So That being said, I'm glad you brought up Kyle Rudolph too. He showed up for multiple catches for either the first or second time this season, 3 for 40. Basically, seldom used at this point in his career, but still showed up in big moments multiple times. He remains the reliable TE1 that you kind of expected with Irv Smith still sort of developing. Now, the last piece here is, I'll just we'll kind of gloss over the fact that Adam Thielen was quiet again for the second week because, and kind of put
that's
that
a
down.
result. That's just a result of the game plan.
Right. That's what I was going to say. We'll just pin that one down as the fact that they're not throwing the ball as much. Now, you get the Amir Abdullah play kind of caught everyone by surprise, and I imagine anger too, because you get a Vikings touchdown out of a running back that's not named Dalvin Cook, and I'm sure many of your fantasy lineups suffered. But that was nice to see, right?
I mean, that's getting greedy at that point. You get like 50 points from Cook last week or whatever, and then you got 200 plus and 2 touchdowns this week. Like, I don't know how much you can be complaining at that point, but
I will say though that Amir Abdullah play. So my buddy who doesn't watch a whole lot of football but is aware of how football is, so like he knows like the top 30 on the Vikings roster, not all 53. Was like, who the hell was that guy that just scored? And I was like, Amir Abdullah, and he goes, from Nebraska? I go, yeah. He goes, when did we get him? I was like, we've had him for like 3 years. He's not good in the NFL. And he's like, oh, okay. But he looked good for like that moment. He looked like Nebraska Amir Abdullah. Not that this matters long term, but I wanted to,
revenge game touchdown against Detroit.
That's a good point too. That's also a great point. It's a great place to wrap that up too. And then on the defensive side of the ball here. Now,
Jeff Gladney. That's a big one. That's a big one I wanted to touch on. That guy was a stud. I think he
take it away.
He played in the slot all day. Detroit was passing the ball all day. He allowed 13 yards in the slot, which is exceptional. I think PFF said something about how he had the best slot corner day in the NFL yesterday. Now, granted, you can say what you want about Detroit's weapons. They were down Galladay. But, he himself in the slot, it was a lot. He took a big step forward, and the Vikings needed that from the cornerback group that has been depleted and reeling pretty much all season long. So that was good to get some positivity out of that group.
Absolutely. So it's big, of course, that you get the young guy performing, especially because we've had question marks about Jeff Gladney over the way that he's performed, but now he's just kind of looking like a rookie corner, right? High ups, high downs, right? That's kind of where he's at in his career. And this, this level, right? This bar that he just set for kind of the standard of which we can expect from him on his best days. That's great. If we can get that guy, 10 times a year, he'll make a lot of money in the NFL. Mm-hmm. This was a great performance by Gladney. Also huge for the linebacking core, right?
Eric Wilson has a nose for the football, doesn't he?
He does. He definitely does. Whether it's picking up, what does he have? 4 total turnovers himself now with 2 interceptions and 2 fumble recoveries, I believe.
I want to say he's had one like 3 straight weeks or something where it's either a fumble or an interception or something like that. Because he's around, like if there's a turnover created by the Vikings, it's generally Eric Wilson has something to do with it, whether it's an interception or a fumble or something like that. He's around the ball.
And that's something that dates back to, I believe he was Cincinnati, right? I remember seeing he had a nose for the ball at Cincinnati. So this isn't new for him. It's just kind of coming together at the professional level, which is great to see with Anthony Barr out. Vikings obviously needed someone to step up there so that they could run a dime defense with 2 linebackers. They needed someone to step in and play, plug that hole. And Eric Wilson has certainly done that for the past 2 weeks. And I think he's given us reason to believe it should continue, right? He's an all-faceted player right now. He's intercepting passes. He's creating sacks or getting sacks himself, tackles for loss, pass deflections. He's hitting the quarterback. He's making tackles. He led the team in tackles yesterday with 13. He's doing everything you can ask from that position and a little bit more as well, which is big news because the guy who's playing next to him continues to be arguably the best cover linebacker in the league. Proved it yesterday in probably the game's biggest moment. With Detroit driving down with the potential to bring the game within 1 score, kind of a Vikings collapse situation. And Eric Kendricks takes it in the back of the end zone and smartly doesn't try to run it out, which was nice to see. So, outstanding performance by those 2 levels. I didn't even mention Chris Boyd, by the way, who I think had the best professional game of his career, based strictly off of a couple of big moments where he was in the right spot. But the rest of this unit did well, too. I mean, you can say good things about Armin Watts, Shamar Stephen. Your boy Mata Afa looked good. I mean, overall, Jeff Gladney is definitely the star here with Kendricks and Wilson, kind of, if you think of it like a Mario Kart, when you finish it up and they put you up on the screen, right, and they got the first, second, and third place.
Yeah.
I think of it as, Jeff Gladney's your star at 1, Eric Wilson at 2, and Eric Kendricks is kind of just resistant to the fact that he has to sit there at 3 for this one individual game. I didn't even mention the fact that Harrison Smith had an interception, by the way, just because it came from Chase Daniel. So great overall game by the defense for sure.
Right. I mean, this is where you see football as a cumulative effort, right? Because the Vikings established offensively their dominance right away and took that early lead so quickly and took control of the game that it forced the Lions offense to be in catch-up mode, and that made things so much easier for the Minnesota Vikings defense. So, I mean, yeah, there's an excellent game all around. I think clearly the only concern here is the special teams, which you had the Dan Bailey extra point, I believe, and then you had obviously the 2 blocked punts that are something to keep an eye on as the Vikings move forward here, where those type of things can be really damaging in terms of field position and swinging a win probability, if you will. But good thing this week is the game was kind of already tilted heavily in Minnesota's favor, but in a game like next week at Soldier Field where it's a different environment, it's primetime Kirk we're talking about, like a blocked punt can be pretty damaging.
Absolutely. I want to express more concern about that specific element here, the blocked punts, because in any other scenario, 2 consecutive blocked punts is a big problem. And I believe it was the same guy on the Lions that got both of them too.
Yeah. And now, and I'm not going to act like I know who's responsible. Like I'm no special teams coach or anything like that. I mean, clearly something went wrong and needs to be fixed. That's the only thing I know. But that's just it's I think for the sake of Minnesota special teamers, coaching staff, and players, like they're lucky that this game was already mostly out of hand by the time that those happened.
Right. This just overall, by the way, not a great performance by special teams, just as a whole. Like those are the 2 big moments that you can't have those happen next week.
Because there's been some concerns about cutting too, long snapper, where he's had some. I think he was a couple times high last week, then low this week. So
there's a missed extra point this week as well. That might have factored in some place. You also consider the fact that KJ Osborne did not look good in punt returns.
Yeah. There's
ran backward one time, and then the other time took it out when he probably shouldn't have out of the end zone. So overall, not a banner week for the Vikings special team. But you're right. It doesn't matter this week, right? It's the third phase of the game for a reason, and the Vikings did phases 1 and 2 so well that they were allowed to just basically not care about phase 3. That's
just
essentially how
it went.
They didn't, right? And some, if this score was 34-20 in favor of Detroit, I can assure you I would be yelling about the special teams right now. But I'm not, because it's not that way, and the Vikings got the W here. And with that being said, we can finally kind of talk about what I have been trying to talk about this entire episode, and that's kind of our sentiments regarding where the Vikings stand now. Now, it would have been very, very set in stone had the Vikings gone out and lost to Detroit this past weekend, right? Vikings moved to 2-6. You get your win against the Packers. You take that home with you. You know it. It was officially your 2020 Super Bowl. Put that in your back pocket and hold on to it when Green Bay fans try to yell at you, and you move on. We start thinking about the draft. That's not what happened, though. The Vikings went out and, again, like we have been saying, put together arguably their first or second best offensive performance of the season, continued to be arguably one of the best offensive teams in the NFL, and are showing real signs of improvement on both sides of the football. And so now you have a very real predicament because of what we talked about last week, and that's starting to come to fruition now this week. So putting an eye on the conference standings, first and foremost, up top right now, it's New Orleans, Seattle, Green Bay, and hilariously, Philadelphia. Okay? After those 4 teams, your next 3 slots, Tampa Bay, Arizona, Los Angeles. Okay? The next 2 teams after that, Minnesota, Chicago. Chicago has a 1-game edge, of course, right now. Or excuse me, a 2-game edge. Now, what makes that important is that the Vikings need the Rams to lose 1 football game now. 1 football game next week. And if they beat the Bears, they'll be right back in it. As soon as next week. Okay?
Yeah. So here's kind of breaking it down. So at this point we're looking at wild card, right? It doesn't seem like a divisional title is realistic, given that Green Bay's probably going to have enough wins to stay ahead of Minnesota, right? But you're looking at this wild card race. You mentioned some of these teams. You're kind of looking at Arizona, the Rams, the Saints, or the Bucks, depending on which team takes that division. As of now, it looks like the Saints, and so the Bucks. But the Vikings essentially, and 49ers as well, are in the mix. So the Vikings need to overtake 3 of the teams immediately above them in the race right now, which would be Arizona, Chicago, the Rams, or the Niners, while also staying ahead of their 3-win teams. So like Detroit, Atlanta, Carolina. And then again, we're going to bring it up again. Minnesota's schedule moving forward here, very, all 4 games are winnable, right? Chicago is reeling incredibly right now. That offense looks hideous. They couldn't put up anything even against the Titans defense, which is depleted. Then you get, Jacksonville, Carolina, Dallas, those 3 teams all at home. And so all of a sudden you look at that, you think 4 winnable games, that puts the Vikings at 7-5. Now this is getting very optimistic here, but their chances at a playoff spot, given that there are now 7, they're growing quickly. And Minnesota has really 2 tough games left on the schedule that you think, well, they might not win these ones. And that's at Tampa and at New Orleans. Other than that, like the rest of their games look very winnable. If they can steal one of those games down the stretch, a 9-7 finish, to sneak into a 7 spot looks pretty realistic. And of course, we should mention like Atlanta, Chicago, San Francisco, they all lost this week. And so that is also helping Minnesota in that playoff race.
Absolutely. So essentially what has happened here is we went from 2 weeks ago about talking number 1 pick to kind of last week where it became hopeful. Not even hopeful. Like
the Packers win obviously sparked something because that was like, okay, this team actually is kind of maybe good, like a little bit.
And now all of a sudden the Vikings are objectively in a position where their playoff position is plausible. Not probable, plausible. Okay? So now we have that in front of us, knowing what we do right now. The Monday night game is not going to affect the playoff picture in the NFC at all. The Vikings are essentially 2.5 games out of a playoff spot. They have to play Chicago twice still. It starts next week on Monday night. Now, I think of this kind of as, from a fan perspective, right? The last 3 weeks. This week right now against Detroit, the previous week, last week against Green Bay, and next week against Chicago as kind of 3 acts, right? Think of like a Shakespeare play. You got 3 different acts here. The Green Bay one was instrumental. It's the most important of the 3. It gets you back in it, right? That victory was something none of us saw coming. We had already mailed that one in. It changed the entire dynamic, and it kind of creates this series of events that we're now on this ride on now. Act 2, the one that the Vikings just got through against Detroit, is probably the least important, but it gives you more confidence in Act 1, right? As a result of the Vikings' victory last week, this week confirms that last week was not a fluke. This offense is for real. It's one of the best in the league. We have confidence in that element of this team. Now, Act 3 is probably the second most important of the 3, but it is the backbreaker, right? If the Vikings can win against Chicago on Monday night, they get rid of a bunch of tropes, right? Those stupid narratives that Drew and I bring up every single year. He eliminates all of that first and foremost. So that's a confidence and morale booster right there. More importantly, objectively, it puts the Vikings in pole position outside of Green Bay to control the division. Because then all of a sudden they can beat Chicago again down the road at home, by the way, and beat the Lions. And they could finish this season with a 5-1 record in the division. If they do that and miss the playoffs, that's very hard to do. That's extremely hard to do. So this final act here to determine whether or not we should be back, right? The question this week is, are the Vikings back? Next week, it's, are we back or are we not? Because if the Vikings lose next week, it's over. But if they win next week, hey, we might be cooking something here. And it's not just Dalvin. It might be cooking like a legitimate candidacy to make the postseason as a team that you don't think was going to beat you, but could come from behind and beat you because they have the capacity to do so. All of that will be confirmed next week. And 4-5 isn't shabby after 9 weeks of play or 9 games of play, especially considering the Vikings schedule, which you alluded to earlier.
Right. That's what I was going to mention, is that the schedule is going to get much easier. And like you said, 4-5 based on games against, at Seattle versus Tennessee, at Green Bay, well, Green Bay twice, right? You have all these games on the schedule that, you kind of going into the season, we're thinking probably, a loss, right? Or, even now looking back at where these teams are at, you're thinking, well, the Vikings lost that game. And so now moving forward, and I think the way you put that is pretty solid, right? Because at 1-5 is where the Vikings were before the Green Bay game, and it's kind of it takes more than just one win to think, okay, the Vikings can do this, and there is that three act play, right? Where Act One is, first of all, they got to get wins against whoever the next opponent is. They have to win that game. You can't lose anymore. And it happened to be Green Bay, the division rival, perhaps the best team in the NFC at that point, went out and did it. And then the next one is kind of solidifying that case or giving support to that evidence. And they did that against Detroit and in dominant fashion. Now it's Chicago, where you got to get rid of the narratives and the kind of spotlight that's on Kirk Cousins, primetime Kirk, blah, blah, blah. And you can see if this game plan of Dalvin Cook can last against a better defense, on the road, tough environment, where it's, again, another must-win game against a team that is also vying for one of those wild card spots.
Right. It's extremely important. Objectively, emotionally, whatever way you want to look at it, this next week against Chicago is the most recent opportunity for the Vikings to kind of cast aside those narratives. And this is as big of, for the Kirk Cousins era, not for the Vikings franchise history, but for the Kirk Cousins era, this game is defining, right?
It's not Saints playoff game defining, but it's,
right.
And the problem that's going to come up with this too, and this is kind of going on a bit of a tangent, but if the Vikings are to make a run here, with the way that they're playing right now, it's going to have as little to do with Kirk as it could with like any quarterback in the league, if that makes sense. Like the way the Vikings play, they're doing everything they can to take the ball out of Kirk's hands and rely on other people on the team. But with that said, like the QB wins narrative is what's driving all this in the first place. Like Kirk's performances statistically have not been that bad on primetime. It's just that his team loses because his teams are defensively giving up so many points. Yada yada yada. Now another chance against the Bears, who are playing terribly right now, to steal maybe another win. And again, 4-5 through 9 games with 3 relatively easy home games. I don't want to say that with too much confidence, but relatively easy home opponents coming up after that would be a great spot to be in, considering they were 1-5 after having a home loss, getting destroyed by Atlanta just a few weeks ago.
Okay, so considering everything that we now know and that we've detailed and gone through, Vikings stand at 3-5 is kind of begs the question now, are the Vikings the 2-0 team that we've seen the last 2 weeks, or are they the 1-5 team that we saw the first 6 weeks? So what I mean here is it's 2 very different styles, right? Like obviously the Vikings were competitive in Tennessee and Seattle, but their style of play when they were competing with those 2 teams was traditional 2020 contemporary style of play, right? Shootout, trying to beat them through the air, complementing your offense on the ground. It's the completely different story. I think we know which team the Vikings want to be, right? Like that's objectively proven through every press conference that Mike Zimmer has ever had. But are they this team, or do they have to be the other team?
I think they almost have to be the run first team, which is crazy to think about. But like it just seems like you can't trying to living and dying by Kirk Cousins in a shootout just doesn't seem sustainable or like a long-term way to have success. And as of now, he's your quarterback, so you're kind of stuck with him, and you have the best running back in football. So I think you kind of have to kind of hope that this like the outdated philosophy of Zimmer can work just long enough to give this team a chance here in 2020. But I'm I feel like I'm being very hypocritical of myself because I'm very I'm still subscribed to that idea that you got to have a quarterback that can keep up in a shootout, high octane offense, like an offensive head coach. Passing the ball is the most efficient way. All that, like I'm still subscribed to that, but I think the Vikings just happen to be unique enough with the roster that they have, with the coaching staff that they have, that maybe running the ball the way they do It's just the way it is for this team because you look at their percentage of running the ball on second and long, second and short, clearly higher run rate than anybody in the league, and yet they're the most efficient offense in football. So maybe that's just the way the Vikings have to do things.
Last question. We're going to wrap this thing up. Now, the Tennessee Titans, your favorite team, not named the Vikings.
Yeah, you're right.
They set a model last year, which there are a couple teams following it now. It's not just the Vikings.
I like where this question is going. I like this.
Right. Okay. So ultimately what it kind of comes down to is Kirk Cousins versus Ryan Tannehill, because the rest of these two rosters, we talked about it when they played each other, are composed very similar. The composition in general is basically the same, with the exception that Derrick Henry is a 2-down runner and they throw in a 3rd-down running back, whereas Dalvin Cook is a 3-down runner who is not necessarily as dominant on the goal line or in short yardage situations. That's really the only, obviously there's different players, right? But generally speaking, the overall philosophy, the overall kind of output of these two teams is basically the same outside of those two quarterbacks, right? Kirk Cousins is probably better with volume numbers and just getting the ball down the field. Ryan Tannehill, on the other hand, has kind of been embedded within that strategy, and kind of the same strategy the Vikings have used the last 2 weeks, where you're trying to be efficient. You make the throws when you need to make them. You're going to throw the ball 15 to 20 times, but 8 of those throws are going to really, really matter. And we need you to complete those passes, and we need you to not drop back, get sacked, and fumble the ball into your own end zone on those plays. Ryan Tannehill has proven that he can do that at a high level, and that's still worth paying for. Right. Because a game manager who doesn't screw it up when it counts and gets it done when it matters is worth just as much as any quarterback. So, ultimately, here's my question then. Can Kirk Cousins be Ryan Tannehill? Is he better than Ryan Tannehill? Or what's the situation there? Because they went to the AFC Championship last year, and they beat the best team on football on paper going into the postseason last season. They beat a team that wasn't supposed to beat them. They competed with a team that also wasn't supposed to beat them. I don't know. Can Kirk Cousins do that same job for this team, and can the Vikings make the same type of run that Tennessee did last year where this philosophy all came together?
Yeah, they can. I think Kirk Cousins could be Ryan Tannehill. I don't want to get too optimistic with things right now, but that's exactly the formula that Mike Zimmer wants to use to win, and that's exactly what it's going to take. And if you look back at those Titans playoff games, Tannehill threw the ball 14 times,
right,
in both of them. So that's exactly like
Baltimore too.
Yeah, and I think you're right about the roster construction. It's very similar. The philosophy of Vrabel and Zimmer, very similar. It's going to take a run, and as we saw with the Titans, they were 9-7 when they did this, and the Vikings could just get in. And I don't want to say get hot like Flacco, like in 2012 or whatever, right? Or 2013, but it would take something like that for the Vikings to actually seriously contend. But I think it's very doable, and especially, and I'm totally riding on recency bias right now. But hey, I'm good with that.
That's all we have right now is recency bias, and really, I mean, football is all about small sample sizes, right? This small sample size is pretty damn good, and I'm excited about it, and I think that you should be too. So, with all that being said, Vikings head into a very difficult Monday night showdown with Chicago. Or is that Monday night or is that Sunday night? I think it's Monday night. Whatever night it is, they're playing against Chicago next week. You know that. And we'll talk about that on Thursday here. Drew and I will be back breaking down that matchup, the importance of that matchup, the important, individual matchups that we'll see in that game, and kind of just asking the question, are the Vikings, can they really do this? Because they're going to have a chance to prove that next Monday. And, of course, every other game down the stretch is going to matter here. But when you stand at 4-5 through 9 games, you give yourself a chance. And that's the position the Vikings have put themselves in by playing as well they did the past 2 weeks, and specifically against the Lions on Sunday. So thank you as always for listening to the show. We appreciate that. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcasts. Make sure to check out the Climbing the Pocket Network and Daily Norseman. You can find Drew and I on YouTube as well if you want to leave a comment there. You can also leave a comment in the Daily Norseman comment section. Let us know where you're at. I've been reading all that stuff. It's fun to see where you guys are at and kind of riding this roller coaster with us. So thanks as always, and we will catch you later on this week.